This unit of S244, Field Observer and Fire Effects Monitor, presents an introduction to fire effects monitoring. The unit builds on your knowledge of the fire environment gained in S290, Intermediate Fire Behavior, and in the previous Environmental Observations unit of this course. This unit has 3 parts. Lesson 1, General Concepts of Fire Effects. Lesson 2, Methods for Measuring Fire Effects. And Lesson 3, Plots and Protocols. Upon completion of this unit, students will be able to 1. Describe common fire effects and methods by which to measure and document these effects. 2. Implement fuel loading and photo monitoring protocols. 3. List sources of other protocols available for fire effects monitoring. And 4. Characterize and report the range of variability of first-order fire effects due to changes in fire behavior and the plant community. These objectives are directly related to task number 11 in the Fire Effects Monitor and Field Observer Position Taskbook. In Lesson 1, we'll cover some general concepts so you can understand what causes specific fire effects and which aspects are important to observe and document when you are assigned to monitor a fire. These concepts include 1. The difference between first-order fire effects and second-order fire effects, and how this difference relates to the positions of Fire Effects Monitor and Field Observer. 2. How fire behavior interacts with a species' adaptations to fire to produce fire effects. 3. Fire regimes and how fire adaptations are influenced by fire regimes. And 4. How and why fire effects vary over space and time. The first concept is the difference between what are referred to as first-order and second-order fire effects. First-order fire effects are those effects caused by the direct and immediate result of a fire. They are the effects observable within a short time after the fire has passed, such as crown scorch, top kill, fuel consumption, and animal mortality due to burns. Second-order effects are the indirect effects that occur later as a result of the first-order effects. You might think of a second-order effect as the effects of the effect. For example, the first-order fire effect of native grass mortality may provide the opportunity for non-native invasive plants, such as cheatgrass, to invade a site, which would be a second-order fire effect. Other examples of second-order fire effects include increased germination of fire-dependent species, delayed plant mortality due to root damage, and animal mortality due to loss of habitat. Animals are often able to escape the direct effects of fire due to their mobility, but can be impacted by the effects of fire on vegetation, such as the short-term loss of their habitat. Wildlife mortality due to loss of forage is a second-order fire effect. For example, during the 1988 Yellowstone fires, around 1% of the park's elk were killed by burning or smoke inhalation, a first-order fire effect. But loss of forage due to drought and fire, combined with a severe winter, caused 40% mortality in the elk population during the following winter, a second-order fire effect. On the other hand, wildlife habitat can also be enhanced through burning. Increased wildlife habitat is often a land management goal, and fire may be used to achieve this goal. For example, a prescribed fire management objective in support of this goal might be to top kill 60 to 80% of the understory shrubs in order to increase sprouting of red stem ceanothus, a second-order fire effect which would enhance the forage for mule deer. Notice that fire effects, whether first-order or second-order, can be beneficial to some species and detrimental to others. Fire effects are neither good nor bad by themselves. They are considered desirable or undesirable based on land management objectives. As a fire effects monitor or field observer on a prescribed fire or a wildfire assignment, your task is to observe and document the immediate post-fire or first-order fire effects. The second-order fire effects are generally not apparent until weeks, months, or even years after the fire, and monitoring them is generally part of a larger, more comprehensive land management plan. If you see a need to follow up with additional future monitoring, be sure to note that as part of your monitoring report. Most of the first-order fire effects you will be observing and documenting are related to fire's effect on vegetation. Because first-order fire effects on vegetation usually determine second-order fire effects on other elements of the ecosystem. For instance, the loss of ground cover vegetation, a first-order fire effect, can lead to soil erosion, a second-order fire effect, in the future. So, in the next section, we'll look at how fire behavior interacts with plants' adaptations to fire to produce fire effects. Understanding this concept will help you determine whether the predicted fire behavior will have the desired effect on vegetation and meet management objectives for the fire. Standard terminology exists for describing the behavior of wildland fires. It is important to understand the different properties a wildland fire can have, how they can be described, and how the various aspects of fire behavior can be related to fire effects. Monitoring and documenting fire behavior and characteristics according to these standard terms can increase understanding of the relationship between a specific fire's behavior and heat characteristics and the effect of that fire. We'll start our review of fire behavior by looking at the nature of heat exposure and how it relates to fire behavior. Then, we'll briefly review the fire behavior terms residence time, burnout time, fire line intensity, and flame length as they relate to documenting heat exposure. The effects of fire on vegetation are caused by exposure to heat, and exposure to heat is a function of both temperature and time. The hotter the temperature and the longer the exposure to it, the more intense the effects of the fire will be. The lower the temperature, the longer the plant tissue must be exposed to be affected. One effect of exposure to heat is plant mortality. Lethal temperatures can vary by species, but a general guideline in plants is 60 degrees Celsius or 140 degrees Fahrenheit for 60 seconds. The lowest temperature at which plant cells die is between approximately 50 to 55 degrees Celsius or 122 to 131 degrees Fahrenheit. Plant tissue can sustain higher temperatures for greatly decreasing periods of time, as shown in this graph depicting lethal heat exposure for Douglas fir needles. Exposure to heat can also have a beneficial effect on plants that have adaptations requiring heat to stimulate vital functions. For example, some pines, such as jack pine and lodgepole pine, have serotinous cones, meaning that the cones remain closed until heat causes it to open and release its seeds. So, in order to understand and document fire effects monitors and field observers need to be able to describe heat exposure in terms of both time and temperature. We'll use standard fire behavior terminology to accurately characterize these components of heat exposure. Two terms are useful in describing fire behavior in terms of time: residence time and burnout time. The residence time is the length of time the flaming front of the fire is present. In terms of the three phases of combustion, it's the time period when the fire is in the flaming phase, at the point you are monitoring. Burnout time represents the total time for all phases of combustion, flaming, glowing, and smoldering, and is often a more important unit of measurement for monitoring some fire effects than residence time. For monitoring that will later be related to fire effects, an estimate of the total combustion duration of large diameter fuels and the surface layers is important. While it is not important to document the burnout time to the exact minute, it is important to note whether smoldering combustion lasts for only a few minutes, a few hours, or several days. Burnout time is sometimes called fire duration. Now, we'll look at how we document the temperature component of heat exposure. In research projects, a fire's temperature can be measured directly by heat sensors, but in fire effects monitoring, temperature is usually inferred from fire line intensity, which is the rate of heat energy released per unit time per unit length of the fire front. An example of fire line intensity would be 100 BTUs per second per foot. Fire line intensity is an output of the Fire Behavior Prediction System and can be calculated using the Fire Behavior Prediction Program, BEHAVE, or fire behavior nomographs. But in the field, a more common method of estimating fire line intensity, and therefore temperature, is to use flame length. Richard Rothermel, who developed many of the mathematical equations used by the Fire Behavior Prediction System, cautioned that flame length is an elusive parameter that exists in the eye of the beholder. It is a poor quantity to use in a scientific or engineering sense, but it is so readily apparent to fire line personnel and so readily conveys a sense of fire intensity that it is worth featuring as a primary fire variable. This is the reason many prescribed fire or wildfire management objectives specify a flame length. It's an easily observable indication of the fire line intensity and temperature that can be used to predict fire effects or determine which suppression resources might be effective, even if it can be challenging to estimate accurately. However, this method of estimating temperature applies only to the flaming front and the heat above ground. It does not measure the heat pulse downward into the soil. Therefore, it is useful only for predicting fire effects above ground, such as crown scorch and tree mortality due to bowl damage. So, in order to understand and document fire effects monitors and field observers need to be able to describe heat exposure both in terms of the temperature indicators of the fire and the amount of time it burned in the area they were monitoring. We can determine the time using residence time and burnout time, and use flame length as a rough indicator of temperature. Next, we'll discuss how the time and temperature components of heat exposure combine to produce severity, and how we can properly describe severity in fire effects monitoring. The term severity has no single definition in fire management. It is a broad concept that is applied in various ways. Sometimes it is used incorrectly as a synonym for intensity. It is important to remember that intensity refers to a physical property of fire regarding how much heat is produced. Severity, on the other hand, refers to the results or impacts of the fire in terms of environmental change. Because severity has a broad definition and is used to describe different aspects of fire, if the term severity is used in the management objectives of the fire you are assigned to monitor, it's critical that you understand how the term is being used for that specific project. For the purposes of this unit, we will define fire severity and burn severity and describe how these terms will be used, but be aware that you will encounter other definitions for these terms in the course of your work. More specifically, the National Wildfire Coordinating Group, or NWCG, defines fire severity as the degree to which a site has been altered or disrupted by fire. It's traditionally expressed by classifying the magnitude of a fire's impact on a particular resource into qualitative classes ranging from low to medium to high fire severities. A general classification of fire severity defines low, moderate, and high severity in terms of overall effects to the vegetation, surface fuels, and soil. In a low-severity fire, there is only slight modification to the structure of the vegetation, and nearly all mature woody plants survive. There may be some consumption of fine fuels and litter, but the duff remains intact, and there is little or no soil heating. In a moderate or mixed severity fire, some stand structure change occurs through limited mortality of mature woody plants. The foliage of trees and shrubs may be scorched. There is higher consumption of fine fuels and litter, and the duff layer is partially consumed. Some surface soil heating occurs. In a high-severity fire, most or all of the small plants, litter, and duff are consumed. Significant soil heating occurs, sometimes impacting the subsurface layer. There is high mortality of mature plants, including overstory trees. This type of severity is often referred to as a stand-replacing fire. The most obvious and common way to measure severity is through impacts on forested overstory. A specific classification of fire severity targets this impact. Low severity is defined as less than 25% mortality of the dominant overstory species. Moderate severity is 25 to 75% mortality of the overstory species, and high severity is greater than 75% mortality in the overstory. The important point in understanding and documenting fire severity is to identify the particular resource of interest and the classification criteria to be used. We'll discuss classification protocols in detail in Lesson 3 of this unit. Burn severity is a type of fire severity measurement. It specifically targets the fire's impact on the ground due to surface and subsurface heating. NWCG defines burn severity as a qualitative assessment of the heat pulse directed toward the ground during a fire. Burn severity relates to soil heating, large fuel and duff consumption, consumption of the litter and organic layer beneath trees and isolated shrubs, and mortality of buried plant parts. It can be classified into categories of low, medium, and high, based on established criteria that we'll cover in Lesson 3. Burn severity is a function of fire line intensity and burnout time. So even though burn severity is related to fire line intensity, a low-intensity fire does not always produce a low-severity fire. In fact, there can be many combinations of fire line intensity and burn severity on any site, depending on fuel loading and distribution, and site weather and moisture conditions at the time of the fire. For example, any of the combinations of fire line intensity and burn severity on the following slides can occur. In the example on this slide, both the carrier fuels and the organic layer are dry. The result is a fire with high fire line intensity, exhibiting extreme fire behavior, and that is also a deep burning, high severity fire. Flame lengths are long, large fuels are removed, soil organic layers are consumed, and a significant amount of subsurface heating occurs. In this video of grass fire, winds increase the flame lengths and rate of spread, causing high fire line intensity and low residence time. The lack of coarser fuels also decreases burnout time and results in little subsurface heating and minimal impact to the soil and organic layers. In this example, a fire with low fire line intensity ignites ground fuels and the duff and litter layer, which smolder for many days before burning out. The amount of heat is relatively low, but the long burnout time causes high consumption of the organic layer and lethal heating of the underground and surface plant parts. Here, the fuels are moist and the litter and duff layer is wet. The result is a fire with low fire line intensity that also has low severity. That is, there is little heating of the surface or subsurface and minimal consumption of the organic layer. In summary, fire behavior observation and documentation are important to fire effects monitoring because fire behavior is an indication of the amount and duration of heat plants are exposed to by the fire. As a fire effects monitor or field observer, your understanding of fire behavior terminology and ability to apply it accurately is critical to documenting fire effects. Next, we'll discuss the second part of the fire effects equation, adaptations to fire. Plants have evolved strategies to survive or take advantage of exposure to heat from fire. These adaptations interact with the heat created by the fire to create fire effects. These strategies can be divided into two types: structural adaptations that allow an individual plant to survive exposure to fire, and reproductive adaptations that allow a population of plants to survive fire, even if the individual plants don't survive the fire. Structural adaptations, those allowing an individual plant to survive exposure to fire, are generally related to the characteristics of the stand, the crown, the bud structures, or the bark resisting the carrying of fire or insulating critical plant structures from the fire's heat. The structure of a stand affects the way a fire will burn through it. Open stands with some distance between crowns minimize the exchange of heat between crowns during a fire and allow heat and gases to rise through the canopy, reducing crown mortality and crown fire potential. Stands of widely spaced trees with light ground fuels tend to experience frequent, low-intensity fire. In denser stands with greater contact between crowns, considerable mutual heating is possible, and there is higher crown fire potential than in an open stand. Some lodgepole pine forests typically burn at high intensity due to their naturally close spacing. Characteristics of individual tree crown that decrease the impact of fire include low crown density, high crown base height, and the ability to self-prune dead branches. Conversely, a dense crown that extends down near surface fuels will increase the probability of crown fire. In this picture, the Engelmann spruce, on the left, is highly susceptible to torching, while the whitebark pine, in the middle, may be spared due to its high crown base height, sparse crown density, and lack of lower branches. The large buds of some fire-resistant pine species, such as longleaf pine, can absorb more heat before incurring damage than the smaller buds of spruces and firs, and the longer needles provide some insulation from the heat. The seasonality of fire can affect buds as well. Actively growing buds are more sensitive to heat than buds that are dormant. Cambium is the thin layer of living plant tissue that produces the critical plant structures necessary to transport nutrients and water. For thick-barked trees, such as ponderosa pine, western larch, Douglas fir, and Jeffrey pine, the heat-sensitive cambium is well protected from the fire's heat by the insulating layer of bark. Thin-barked trees, such as lodgepole pine, subalpine fir, and most of the spruces, are highly susceptible to cambium damage from the fire's heat. On these thin-barked tree species, the cambium is probably dead beneath any charred bark. So, bark thickness varies by species, with the thickest bark providing the most effective insulation against heat. In addition, Larger diameter trees of any species generally have the thickest bark and are more resistant to cambial damage by fire. As mentioned, reproductive adaptations to fire allow a population to survive exposure to fire even if the individual plant does not. Reproductive adaptations to fire include post-fire sprouting and fire-enhanced seedling establishment. Sprouting is a means by which many plants recover after fire. Surface plant parts produce a plant hormone that inhibits the growth of dormant buds. Fire initiates regeneration from buds by killing the surface plant parts that produce this hormone, allowing the buds to sprout. The buds that become shoots are usually those nearest to the part of the plant killed by the fire. Shoots can originate from dormant buds located on plant parts above the ground surface or from various levels within the litter, duff, and mineral soil layers. The type of plant parts that support dormant buds, and where they are located in or above the soil, are species-specific characteristics. Post-fire seedling establishment is the other strategy employed by plants to regenerate after fire. This survival strategy involves using the environment created by fire to favor the distribution or germination of seeds. We'll discuss the creation of favorable seed beds by fire, the strategy of serotinous seed cones, and how germination of seeds can be enhanced by fire. Fire creates significant changes in site conditions, which can vary substantially within the burned area depending on the severity and pattern of the fire. Consumption of fuel, especially the forest floor, is an important determinant of post-fire conditions because it controls the amount and distribution of good seedbed conditions. Nutrients may be more readily available in ash, and the mineral soil does not dry out as quickly as organic material. The blackened surface causes warmer soil temperatures that enhance nutrient cycling and can favor growth, particularly in cold-limited environments such as boreal forests. After a severe fire, there is less competition from sprouting plants, seedlings, and trees if feeder roots and seeds stored in the duff and soil were killed. There may be little shade in the first few post-fire years because of plant mortality. The physiological requirements of individual species determine whether post-fire conditions are favorable for seedling establishment. For most species that develop from seeds dispersed after fire, the best seedbeds are microsites, where most or all of the organic layer has been removed by fire, because they provide the greatest chance for seedling survival. For some shade-intolerant species, this is the only time that seedlings can establish, but these conditions can result in abundant regeneration, notably of western larch and many species of pine. The serotinous cones of species such as lodgepole, jack, pitch, Table Mountain, and pond pines retain some of their seeds because of the presence of a resin bond between scales on some of their cones. Serotinous cones slowly open and release their seeds after they are heated to at least 45 to 50 degrees Celsius or 113 to 122 degrees Fahrenheit, a temperature that melts the resin bond. Cones protect a significant portion of pitch pine seeds from the high temperatures reached during fire. Lodgepole pine seeds can survive in cones heated in flames for a length of time typical of crown fires. Numerous viable lodgepole pine seeds are dispersed even after a long-duration crown fire. Fire can induce germination of dormant seeds of some species. Germination of some hard seeds can occur only after heat from the fire causes cracks to form in the seed coat, allowing water to enter. Requirements for optimum germination may be species-specific. Fire-stimulated germination has been documented for many hard-seeded genera, including wild hollyhock, blackberries and raspberries, gooseberry, currant, western chokecherry, mountain hollyhock, geranium, muhly grass, and mountain big sagebrush. So, regarding the interaction between fire behavior and adaptations to fire, the knowledge of plant response to fire can be critical to successful application of prescribed fire and fire for resource benefit. To ensure that a desirable range of plant species establishes after a fire, it is important to understand how different prescriptions can produce different fire and plant responses. Designing fire prescriptions and evaluating management objectives requires knowledge of fire behavior, fire severity, species survival mechanisms, and methods of post-fire vegetation recovery. Properly conducted, the fire treatment will result in the desired amount of mortality, injury, resprouting, and seedling establishment from the target species. One of the responsibilities of the fire effects monitor or field observer is to report whether the fire behavior produced the desired fire effects for the resources targeted in the management objectives. Next, we'll discuss fire regimes and how they influence plant adaptations and fire effects. Fire regimes are patterns of fire occurrence, frequency, size, severity, and sometimes vegetation and fire effects in a given area or ecosystem. Ecosystems evolved with and adapted to specific fire regimes. In a particular ecosystem, natural fires occurred with fairly regular frequency and a typical season of occurrence, with characteristic fireline intensity and severity, and characteristically did or did not involve the crowns of trees or shrubs. Large differences in fire regimes occurred between ecosystems. For example, frequent, low-intensity surface fires were common in many ponderosa pine ecosystems, whereas fires in big sagebrush were probably less frequent, of higher intensity, and killed much of the sagebrush overstory. High-intensity stand replacement fires, at long intervals, were characteristic of some conifer forest types, while annual fires may have been common on some Great Plains grasslands. A fire regime is a generalization based on fire histories at individual sites. Fire regimes can often be described as cycles because parts of the histories are usually repeated, and the repetitions can be counted and measured. Fire regimes have been described by factors such as fire frequency, size of fire, pattern on the landscape, season of burn, and depth of burn. The more detailed classifications are useful to fire managers, ecologists, and fire effects specialists interested in the intricate aspects of fire effects. The simpler classifications are useful for broad-scale assessments and non-technical audiences. Some of the simplest and most common classification systems use frequency and severity to classify fire regimes. Frequency is defined as the reoccurrence of fire in a given area over time. It is related to the terms mean fire return interval, fire cycle, and fire rotation. Severity, as defined earlier in this lesson, is the degree to which a site has been altered or disrupted by fire. In this context, it usually refers to the effect of fire on the dominant overstory species. Fire Regime Condition Class, or FRCC, is an interagency classification system used to describe the departure of an area from its natural condition. One of the first steps in determining departure is to establish what the naturally occurring fire regime is. FRCC classifies naturally occurring fire regimes into 5 groups based on frequency and severity. This table defines the classification scheme for each of the 5 fire regimes used in FRCC. Although frequency and severity are useful for broad classifications, understanding other aspects of the naturally occurring fire regime can be useful for evaluating an ecosystem's response to fire and the effect it will have on the vegetation. The season, pattern, and size of the naturally occurring fires in an ecosystem influenced the native plants' adaptations to fire. For example, many ponderosa pine stands historically experienced frequent, low-severity fires that were patchy and limited in size. The seed of the ponderosa is high in the crown where low flame lengths do not damage it, and the seed does not disperse far from the parent tree. When uncharacteristically extensive crown fires burn through ponderosa forests, ponderosa seed is destroyed, and the burned area may be too large to be reseeded by surviving ponderosas on the edge of the burn. This may cause the burned area to regrow as another forest type, or convert to another vegetation type, such as shrubland. Natural fire regimes cannot be maintained in unnatural communities. Timber harvest practices, grazing patterns, the accidental or deliberate introduction of exotic plants and animals, and the modification of historical fire patterns through active suppression have changed many plant communities. Interruption of fuel continuity by livestock grazing, road construction, and other developments has resulted in fires that are less frequent, smaller, and of lower fireline intensity in some ecosystems. The introduction of exotic plants such as cheatgrass, coupled with anthropogenic ignition sources, has greatly increased fire size and frequency in other ecosystems. In summary, fire regimes influence adaptations to fire. That is, plants have adaptations that allow them to survive under the characteristic fire regime. Fire that is uncharacteristic of the natural fire regime may defeat the native species' ability to survive exposure to fire and cause irreversible changes to the ecosystem. Next, we'll look at how and why fire effects can vary over time and space. In monitoring fire effects as a fire effects monitor or field observer, you will find that the effects you observed and documented on one part of a fire may differ significantly from what you observed on another part of the same fire. Or, you may reburn an area that you burned before, only to find that you produced different fire effects the second time around. To begin our discussion of how and why fire effects vary over time and space, we'll go back to an earlier concept. Fire behavior interacts with organisms and their adaptations to fire to produce fire effects. Therefore, variability in fire behavior and in the plant community will interact to create variability in fire effects. You'll remember from Unit 6 that fire behavior is the manner in which a fire reacts to the influences of fuel, weather, and topography. Fuels can vary a great deal over small areas in terms of quantity, arrangement, moisture content, and continuity. And topography can vary spatially over even short distances. The weather can change by the minute and interact with topography to create microclimates. These varying conditions interact to cause the sometimes rapid changes in fire behavior that you have observed in the past. As we've discussed, the changes in fire behavior change the amount of heat plants and other components of the ecosystem are exposed to by the fire, and cause the lethal heat zone created by fire to vary significantly in time and space, changing the fire effects. The plant community also changes over time and space. Different soils and microclimates within a small area can support different plant communities, which in turn may have varying degrees of fire resistance. The structure and fire tolerance of a plant community may be altered by past disturbances such as previous fires, windstorms, or human activities such as timber harvest, livestock grazing, or fuel treatments. Seasonal differences in plant development, reproductive stage, flammability and curing, and exposure of heat-sensitive structures leads to differences in plant responses to fire. For example, grasses are more susceptible to heat damage during their active growing period than when they are dormant. In summary of Lesson 1, let's review the most important points. Fire behavior is an indication of the amount and duration of heat the plant is exposed to by the fire. Fire effects on vegetation are the result of an interaction between the heat exposure created by the fire and the plant's adaptations to fire. Fire regimes influence adaptations to fire. That is, plants have adaptations that allow them to survive under the characteristic fire regime. The fire environment and plant communities vary spatially and temporally. Therefore, fire effects can be expected to vary widely over space and time. Next are a few comprehension check questions. Note that these questions are not graded. Select an answer for the question and click Submit to check your answer. Click Next to move to the next question, or Previous to review or redo a question. If you are finished with the Lesson 1 material, close the entire window the video is displayed in and proceed to Lesson 2 of this unit, where we'll cover specific techniques for measuring and documenting these fire effects.